Yeah, yeah. Hello. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is George Perkovich. I'm with the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel. You have the bios in the catalog here, but we have a very distinguished and appropriate group to talk about our topic here, which is retrospective in a way, looking back on the U.S. India nuclear deal, which became the NSG India nuclear deal and was first announced in the summer of 2005, so it's 10 years ago. But our intention really is to look forward and draw lessons that could be learned from what's happened in the past 10 years here, and to think about issues where what's evolved over the last 10 years could be applied going forward. So of course we are going to look back, but the aim is to look forward. On the far right, which I don't know if is metaphorically correct politically, is my dear friend Rakesh Sood. You have his bio. For those of you who don't know the Indian system, the places where he's been ambassador, so Geneva, then Afghanistan, then Nepal, and then Paris, are indicative of his great stature and accomplishment in the Indian diplomatic services. These are the postings where they send the real stars. And then after that, they didn't let him go, so they brought him back, and he was the special advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh until the election, basically, on disarmament issues. So we're delighted to have Rakesh here. Bob Einhorn doesn't need an introduction to those of you who've worked on these issues in the United States. I would just say that I first met and encountered Bob probably about 25, 23 years ago, and it was working on South Asian nuclear issues. And so, and Rakesh was then too, so we all kind of go back to the same era. So Bob's very well placed to discuss this. And then in John Carlson from Australia, we have not only one of the world's leading experts on safeguards, but somebody who has really studied the nitty-gritty of, in a sense, the implementation of an aspect of nuclear cooperation with India, in particular that the government of Australia is considering in their bilateral negotiation with the Indians. And he has a paper that he's prepared on this, which is, I think, the most kind of penetrating, detailed analysis of the safeguards agreements, but the implications of them in the bilateral context, but also the IAEA India context. And that paper is available on the Carnegie website now if you go to it, and you can download it there. But it really, really is a wonderful piece of research. So with that introduction, I just want to start rather simply and ask each of our panelists if they think back to the promises that were made in 2005, or in promises in the sense that in the U.S. anyway, Condoleezza Rice, other officials testifying in Congress were saying, by the year 2012, we'll have 8 American-built nuclear reactors under construction in India. It'll produce 15,000 jobs in the nuclear industry. You had the U.S. India Business Council talking about 120,000 jobs deriving from this agreement. So there are a lot of very positive statements that were made, and in India, much less dramatically so, but there was a lot of hope based on this agreement. And then at the same time, people who were pessimistic about it also were saying things that were quite dire. So that as a result of this agreement, India would dramatically ramp up its production of fuel for nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons themselves. So this agreement would produce a nuclear arms race that would greatly accelerate as a result of the agreement. That it could collapse the nonproliferation regime. So we had a lot of Sturm und Drang in 2005. And so one of the things I want to do is get a sense from each of you, you know, what were the two most positive results that you see from the agreement? And then we'll swing back around and get your sense of the two most negative repercussions of the agreement. And then from then we're going to look forward. But Rakesh, let me start with you.
Thank you, George. At the outset, let me thank Carnegie for inviting me to speak today on this particular issue. And what I would like to say is that even though we are speaking at the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference, but nonetheless, no bilateral relationship, India-US, no exception to it, no bilateral relationship which is a fairly broad-based relationship can be limited purely to one dimension, and the nuclear area is just one dimension of it. I mean, you have to look at it in the context of what the nuclear dimension meant for the India-US relationship. In all the years that we've spent talking about nuclear matters, and while 2005, as you said, is a good benchmark, because that's the first time that during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit to Washington, the idea of normalizing civilian nuclear cooperation between India and US was articulated formally in the joint statement, although it took some time before the agreement actually got signed. But dialogue on that began, as George reminded me and Bob, way back in 1992, during President Bush Sr.'s period, and then continued during the Clinton administration, continued during the Bush administration, and then we saw during President Obama's recent visit in January, we saw the developments relating to the liability issue. So when you look at the nuclear dimension, I think you have to place it in the overall context of the India-US relationship and the India-US relationship in a changing world. I think in the session just before ours, when you're talking about China, and there was a very interesting, very revealing kind of a thing, which was the basic geopolitical shift that is taking place from, in a sense, the Euro-Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific. Now, end of the Cold War, and I still remember how we, India and the United States, started talking about nuclear issues at that point in time. At that time, the idea of normalizing civilian nuclear cooperation seemed a very far cry. And at that time, this meeting took place between President Bush Sr. and the then Indian Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. And it was 31st of January, 1992, in New York, on the margins of the UN Security Council summit that was taking place. And on the margins of that, when these two leaders met and they talked about it, and they said, well, the world has changed, the Cold War had ended. And they said, we need to talk about, we need to sort of start a more substantive dialogue. And since the nuclear issue had been something which had been a hurdle or had been a prickly issue between the two countries, I mean, in their wisdom, the two leaders decided that that is the issue on which we would start a dialogue. And that's how the dialogue began, on developing a better appreciation, a better understanding of each other's position, till it led through different stages in 2005 to the conceptualization, and subsequently in 2008 to the India-US nuclear deal, which normalized or created the prospects for civilian nuclear cooperation. So I think we have to look at it in that broader context and not merely look at it through the context of as purely a nuclear deal and how many reactors we've been able to set up and so on. We will, because I think what we have seen is a continued commitment on the part of various US administrations as well as Indian prime ministers to take the dialogue process forward. In other words, to remain committed to the nuclear dialogue as part of developing a better strategic relationship between India and the United States. I mean, I still remember in 1998, which was after the test, because before that, the normal description for India and the United States was estranged democracies. And gradually, it became, by the end of the 90s, engaged democracies. And I think later on, in the first decade of the present century, we started seeing words like indispensable partnership, two democracies, Asia-Pacific, and so on and so on. So I think we have to look at it in the broader context, and it is useful to look at it from that point of view. The second point I'd like to make is that in any relationship between two major countries, there is always an element of transactions, in the sense of there is never a complete agreement on every single aspect, because different countries have had different histories, and in any case, a lot of times on issues, it also, where you stand depends on where you sit. So, I mean, for India, in a particular neighborhood, there are certain concerns. We don't expect the US to have a complete convergence of views on those concerns, and vice versa. But nonetheless, we do hope that through dialogue, we are able to develop a better understanding and a better appreciation of those concerns, so that these transactions, or the better understandings that you develop, and therefore decisions that are taken, the transactions actually become milestones in developing that strategic partnership, in deepening it, in broadening it, and getting to where we want to take the relationship. And I think these are two key aspects of this India-US deal, because of the legacy that it had of '74 and so on, that talking about it, moving it forward, meant that you were putting this hurdle behind you. And that's what this deal, in my view, attempted to do.
Thanks, Rakesh.
George, first of all, thank you. Thank Carnegie for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with the three of you. You asked about what are some of the positive effects, the benefits of the deal. There clearly were some benefits of the deal. The foremost one, I think, was that it opened a new chapter in U.S.-Indian bilateral relations. I think the huge nuclear hurdle to this relationship was pushed aside very significantly. And the relationship improved both in content and in tone. But if you recall back 10 years ago, some of the proponents of the deal had expectations, articulated expectations that may have been unrealistic. One of these was to talk about a new strategic partnership between the United States and India. The idea was that the U.S. and India could work very closely on some of the major international problems of the time. Some members of the George W. Bush administration at the time privately would indicate that one of the benefits was that the U.S. and India could work together to counter China, to be a counterweight to an emerging China. But I think this notion of a strategic partnership was an unrealistic expectation. It was not in the cards, and the reason it wasn't is it underestimated the Indian insistence on strategic autonomy, of having a truly independent foreign policy. And I think some of the strongest proponents of the deal at the time didn't fully appreciate that. Another expected benefit, and Rakesh alluded to it, was an increase in the commercial relationship between the countries. Now, for sure, there was an uptick in commercial relations and trade, including in such areas as defense sales between the U.S. And India. But the growth in the trade, as well as the number of U.S. jobs created, and that was a big selling point of the deal at the time, fell far short of the projections that were made at the time. Now, in part, this was the result of some economic policies adopted by Indian governments, some of which are now being reversed by Prime Minister Modi. In the civil nuclear area, the principal obstacle became the 2010 Indian adoption of its liability law. And so as a result of that, a number of U.S. nuclear reactor sales to India were placed in limbo for several years. Hopefully this obstacle is in the process of being moved aside, given the progress made on the liability issue during the recent summit meeting. A third area that I want to mention, the expectation at the time was that the deal was going to bring India into what was called at the time the nonproliferation mainstream. Now, India has indeed had a very positive track record in the area of nonproliferation. It's strengthened very significantly its export control system. It's cooperated with the United States and others in stopping illicit nuclear transfers. Its attitude to the multilateral suppliers regimes has had a sea change. Before, these regimes were seen as the enemy. Now these were groups that India sought to join. India continued its unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing, and I can go on and on. There were a number of very positive developments. But most of these developments would have occurred without an agreement. India has been a responsible member of the international community in the nonproliferation area. I don't think the deal made much of a difference there. For India, the nuclear deal was about ending its nuclear isolation. It was about righting a historic wrong. It was about gaining India's rightful place in the global nuclear order. It was not about taking on new obligations in the nuclear area, whether new obligations in the civil nuclear area or new obligations toward nuclear weapons. And this was most clearly demonstrated in India's very minimalist attitude toward the application of IAEA safeguards to its civil nuclear reactors. It was also manifest in India's reluctance to assume new commitments analogous to Article 6 of the NPT to pursue nuclear disarmament. So in all of these areas, whether it's strategic partnership, whether it's commercial relations, or whether it's becoming a member of the nonproliferation mainstream, there have been improvements as a result of the deal, but I think the improvements fell well short of expectations at the time.
Great, thanks, Bob. Do you have anything to add to this list so far in terms of benefits, or should we switch?
Yes.
Pivot? Okay, great. Go for it, John.
Yeah, thank you, George. And first, let me thank you for inviting me to this and for Carnegie. And also, I feel very privileged to be sharing the panel with such distinguished people. The other thing I should do is make a disclaimer that although I'm listed on the program as being with NTI, in this particular activity as a personal activity, and I'm expressing my own views. Now, to answer your question, I certainly agree that a very important aspect of the agreement has been to end India's nuclear isolation. I was certainly one of those in the mid-2000s who argued in the Australian system for ending India's peculiar status in the non-proliferation regime. And I think the benefit that's come from that, it will take some time to work its way through, but the availability of modern nuclear technology, modern reactors to India will have a benefit both to India itself and also more broadly internationally in terms of the effect of a larger nuclear power program on environmental pollution and climate change, and also nuclear safety. So I think it was very important for India to be able to access modern technology. I think the extension of IAEA safeguards to India's civil program has also been important. but also disappointing. India has rather limited the application of agency safeguards. It has agreed to apply safeguards to reactors that it was obliged to apply safeguards to anyway, bilaterally supplied reactors. It has only accepted safeguards on half of its existing indigenous reactors, and has given no commitment whatsoever about the future. In fact, is making a point of saying that the fast breeder program will be kept out of safeguards. So I think there's much more that could be done there, but it's a start, and as part of the process, India is also being introduced to modern nuclear material accountancy practices, which under its old safeguards agreement it didn't have. And finally, I'd mention that as the nuclear power sector expands, the interaction with the international community on this will act as a moderating factor for India's behaviour in areas like nuclear testing. We will see the establishment of a constituency that will be arguing within the Indian system to pay much greater attention to international views on Indian activities.
Thanks, John. I don't want to inject my bias too much, but it wasn't overwhelming praise for all the great implications that came out of this deal. But you guys did hold back some. So on the negative side, what would you say were the biggest downsides? And we don't have to be elaborate, but things that that really you find kind of alarming or troubling as you look at the situation. Go ahead.
I think the main thing was the issue that both Rakesh and Bob pointed to, the wider bilateral drivers and the keenness of governments to develop closer relationship with India, and I think the problem is that in that process, non-proliferation interests were sacrificed, and I guess India would say, well, that's really up to its interlocutors as to how strongly they push their policy interest, but it's certainly a fact that non-proliferation policies were significantly diluted, and I think that will have long-term implications in terms of confidence in how nuclear material is being used in India. When the 2005 Bush-Singh statement came out, India said that it was ready to assume the same responsibilities and the same practices as other leading countries, and in fact it has not done so. And I think it's really unfortunate that India has chosen not to fully embrace international standards, and that our various governments have gone along with that.
Can you give a couple, just very briefly, in concrete examples, like two things that are examples where they haven't accepted those responsibilities?
Well, on the narrow nuclear supply side, the fact that India won't provide tracking information for imported material. India takes the view that the application of IAEA safeguards is good enough, and the fact that bilateral partners want to know where their material goes and have certain conditions that they would like to apply to the material, which requires that material be identified as being subject to the particular agreement. India says, well, this is all beside the point. It's redundant, it's expensive, it's inconvenient. We don't want to do it. And I think that really undermines the whole concept of bilateral safeguards. And maybe you could argue do we really need an elaborate bilateral safeguard system these days when the IEA system is so well established? But in India's case, India has not made a complete separation between civilian and military. And India is one of the very few countries, the others being North Korea and Pakistan, that are still producing fissile material for nuclear weapons. So it makes strong and effective safeguards particularly important, and we do not have that. More broadly, I talk about other commitments like the commitments in the NPT, which India might have been willing to take on board, but wasn't. There are various things under the NPT that would apply in India's situation and which India could have given a commitment to, like applying safeguards on all imported material, the separation of military and civil, as I mentioned. I think we've really got a situation where India has decided that it's going to give as little as possible, and unfortunately its bilateral interlocutors have accepted that.
Bob, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Clearly, there were some downsides, but again, I don't think the downsides were quite as serious as some of the critics of the deal at the time had predicted. One downside was that the exception for India in the nuclear suppliers group, I think, contributed to China's readiness to ignore its nuclear supplier group obligations with respect to the sale of additional nuclear reactors to Pakistan. I think the favorable treatment that the United States and the NSG gave to India, I think reinforced Pakistan's sense of isolation. It probably contributed to the perception of a growing military asymmetry between India and Pakistan. I don't know if it had any real impact on Pakistan's determination to enhance its nuclear capabilities, but I think it could have been a factor in that. Also, the deal led a number of non-nuclear weapon states, party to the nonproliferation treaty, to take the view that the United States and others had a double standard, that we were favoring our new good friend, a non-party to the NPT, in ways that we weren't prepared to favor even non-nuclear weapon states that were party to the treaty. And there were a number of complaints about that. But as I said, I think the harm to the overall non-proliferation regime was not as great as many people predicted. Complaints by the non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT were often given as an excuse for not taking on additional responsibilities in the area of non-proliferation. They weren't the real reason that a number of countries weren't prepared to do more. There was a concern, I think you mentioned it, George, that this would lead to a nuclear arms competition, that under the deal, India could import uranium for its civil nuclear program, freeing up indigenous uranium resources for the weapons program. There were concerns at the time this would lead to a dramatic increase in Indian fissile material production. From what I can tell, that hasn't really materialized. So, just as in the case of the assumed benefits of the deal, which didn't quite materialize as much as the proponents expected, the downsides didn't materialize as much as the critics expected.
Right, thanks. Rakesh, do you see any downsides in it?
Well, I would say that perhaps we lost time in moving the deal forward in terms of some of the overall expectations. As I see it, part of the objective, as I mentioned earlier, was the larger relationship between India and the U.S. And I think there we saw positive movement because Trade went up about 5 times, and today U.S. India trade is 100 billion. People are looking at making it. During the recent visit by the president, they're talking of making it 500 billion by 2020. Defense sales was an area which India and U.S. did not exist. And in recent times, we have seen that particular sector grow to where I think last year, the largest number of defense agreements in recent years were signed with the United States, whether it was for helicopters, whether it was for aircraft, C-130, et cetera, Globemaster, things like that. So there has been a fair amount of movement in the overall relationship. Now, the nuclear aspect of it in terms of looking at reactors, and which I think now we will see in the coming months, we will probably see the beginning of negotiations between US companies, particularly Westinghouse and GE, because land has been allocated and so on. And we'll see those negotiations start with the Indian companies, is because of concerns about liability. And it has taken us a couple of years to sort those concerns out. And largely this was due to the political cycles, election cycles in India, and the fact that in 2010, when the liability bill was introduced in Parliament, certain additional clauses came in which led to concerns about ambiguities in the law, which American companies were concerned about. And now that those have been addressed following the understanding, and I think last week we had yet another meeting of U.S. and Indian officials where some kind of language on a legal memoranda was going to be finalized. I think that should clear the way, and hopefully if once the technical issues, financial issues get sorted out during the course of negotiations between Indian companies and Western companies. Now, but one thing I would just like to mention, because, and I think this sort of creeps back into our dialogue. In all these years that I spent talking to the US on nuclear matters, and I think this is probably true even at the highest level when the president and the prime ministers met to talk about it, whether in January this year or in September last year or earlier on. I don't think the word NPT got into the conversation, because everybody realized that that was not the framework within which India-US nuclear exchanges could be conducted. And the NPT is a part of the nuclear order, but it is a nuclear order from which India is excluded. So if India and US have to talk about nuclear exchanges, then it obviously cannot be within that framework. It has to be outside. So when we start talking of NPT-related obligations, it leads to, it sort of brings back areas of difference rather than areas where we can develop convergence. And that's why I think it is important that insofar as the principles of the NPT are concerned, namely commitment to non-proliferation, commitment to disarmament, and so on. I mean, on that, I don't think we have had any difficulties as far as India's commitment to non-proliferation is concerned. Though it has not been a member of the NPT, India has been a responsible member of the international community insofar as the nuclear era is concerned. And the same is true vis-a-vis disarmament initiatives.
But the language in the 2005 agreement didn't refer to the NPT. It said India would take on the responsibilities and obligations of basically the weapon states. And so, you know,
John, right, it didn't say weapon states either, George.
It said the advanced, but it meant weapon states. And,
yeah.
And the point is that they haven't. And so it isn't framed in terms of NPT, but it's obligations that other states in a like category now, nuclear armed states, let's call them, have taken on. But your broader point is I don't think American presidents raise that issue either. Yeah. And I think that's the bigger problem, I would argue, is it's not about India, but it's about the US in a sense, the broader sense of when you have a rule-based system and then the supposed leader or the state that helped create that system moves to change it, and does it in a way that's based on an exemption or a one-off, I think that's the danger. It has nothing to do with India in a sense of Indian behavior or interest, but it's in a way what the U.S. did. And I can remember very well a conversation with two North Korean diplomats, or always two, or at least two, and we were talking, and they said, well, we're not going to disarm, but we want an end to the isolation. And I said, well, that doesn't work. This is about disarmament. And they said, no, it's not. They said, we want what India has. India got to keep its nuclear weapons and got to end the isolation. I said, well, whoa, but North Korea is not India. And I started like listing ways of it. And they said, no, you misunderstand. I said, okay, what did I misunderstand? I'm sure I misunderstood, but what did I misunderstand? It's not about India or North Korea, it's about you. The United States makes the rules, and then the United States, if it wants to, it changes the rules. And so you did it for India, and now we wanted you to do it for us. And I think that's the broader problem here, Bob.
I just want to interject something. I remember after May 98, after the nuclear tests by India and Pakistan, there was a intensive bilateral dialogue.
17 rounds in 2 years.
This was mainly Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh. Rakesh and I spent a lot of quality time together in that period. And the U.S. would ask, what are your objectives in the nuclear area? What are you seeking? And the answer was, we are seeking only a credible minimum deterrent capability. We are not seeking an open-ended arms competition. Well, it's 17 years after that, and if you look around the world, the only active nuclear weapons programs in terms of increases in numbers is in Southern Asia. I don't mean just India and Pakistan, but India and Pakistan, China. And somehow there needs to be some kind of a handle, and it can't be the United States can't impose a solution to this problem. It has to come from the countries of Southern Asia. But I think it's something that needs to be done. And I agree with you, George. It wasn't, I think the expectation was that, of course, India is not going to adhere to the NPT, but to take on responsibilities as if they were an NPT nuclear weapon state, among which is to do something about the nuclear arms competition.
Can we, in looking forward, and the issue of NSG membership comes into play, which is distinct from what's already been agreed, which is an exemption for nuclear cooperation, so that there were the rules that barred cooperation with India, and by the way, Pakistan, Israel, states that weren't party to the NPT. There was an exemption for India that allows nuclear cooperation. Now there's the issue of actual membership in the NSG and then the other multilateral regimes, but focusing on the NSG. Can something be learned about the way the exemption was done and then applied to the question of membership? In other words, is there a better way to do membership, and could there have been a better way to have done the exemption that would reduce some of the dynamic internationally with people saying, well, you're just picking a friend, and therefore it's an arbitrary system which invites a certain amount of resistance. So when you look at the issue of NSG membership, and I'll start with you, Rakesh, should it just be done for India and don't treat it as a systemic issue, or might it make more sense to have a criteria-based approach, so at least there's a sense of rules?
The idea that NSG was membership, and then the idea that it became adherence, and that whole thing, it was never very clear whether it was supposed to be all-inclusive or it was supposed to be like-minded and all the rest of it. So I don't think, and as Bob mentioned, and I think most of this audience probably knows, that there was a point in time when India felt that these export control regimes, India was a target of these export control regimes, and notwithstanding the fact that India's non-proliferation related behavior was as good as any of the members of these regimes. And so subsequently, with changes in the world, with changes in terms of perceptions, and I think that is the key part, I don't think India and US have become allies in that sense. And I don't think in today's world we are looking for allies. What we are looking for is greater convergence. I mean, the notion of alliances, that existed during the Cold War is something that is, it was a part of a different kind of history of the world. In today's world, when we look at Asia Pacific, when we look at the geopolitical spaces, what we are looking for is better understanding, better partnership, better ability to work with each other and share each other's concerns. And I think it is from that point of view that the nuclear dimension also comes into play. In something which is not rule-based, now the NPT, I mean, why India cannot join the NPT? Because of 1 January 1968. I mean, the definition says that if you've exploded a nuclear device before 1 January 68, you're a nuclear weapon state, otherwise you're a non-nuclear weapon state.
We could have changed one digit in that treaty and avoided this whole problem. 1978, or actually 67, 77, India would have tested in 74,
Right.
no problem.
But so the point I'm making is that the NSG in that sense is not a legal, I mean, it's not a treaty-based organization or a treaty-based regime in that sense. And therefore, there has to be, whatever the NSG exemption happens for India, has to be based on a certain political judgment and political reality. Now, after the NSG waiver, it is not just with the United States that India signed a nuclear cooperation agreement. I mean, we've signed nuclear cooperation agreements with more than 10 countries.
Right.
So these countries obviously, and together with India, wanted to move this relationship or this cooperative relationship in the nuclear dimension forward, because it is not necessary that with every single member of the NSG, theoretically it is possible for India to sign such cooperation agreements with every single member of the NSG. But it's not as if we've done so with every single member.
But that's different than membership in the NSG.
But the point I'm making is that there is a political judgment that comes into play here. Right. And I think it is that political judgment which should determine India's membership of the NSG.
But should that political judgment be based on articulated criteria, or should it be based on something that doesn't even have to be articulated? You could just say, yeah, we want India in, we don't want India in. That's my question. And would it be better for the international system in any way that you look at that system to have articulated criteria as opposed to, right, what you're saying is a political call that says, yeah, I like them today or I don't. And by the way, since it's a consensus-based organization, if there aren't criteria, somebody could just say, I don't want them, forget about it. So Bob and then John.
Yeah, let me go back to 2005 on this. Look, it would have been a bad idea to try to keep India in nuclear isolation forever. It was apparent back then, even before then, that a nuclear accommodation had to be reached with India. India is a big player, has all the nuclear equipment technology, a potential supplier, all of that. There were all kinds of reasons for bringing India in, ending the isolation. But I don't believe we should have done it back then in a country-specific way. It made it seem as if we were favoring our new best friend rather than acting on non-proliferation principle. So even back then, I would have said we would make any non-nuclear weapon state, any nuclear armed state not party to the NPT eligible for nuclear cooperation with the United States, provided they met certain criteria. Now, we could debate what criteria there should be, and mine would have been probably a little tougher, than Rakesh would be comfortable with.
Well, we would negotiate, as always.
But I would have made both Pakistan and Israel eligible for nuclear cooperation, and India might have been at the top of the list, or Pakistan, because of the AQ Khan experience, may have had to spend more time working at its export controls. But I would have done that. Now,
so should we do that now?
Now move forward to the membership issue. I think membership in these international regimes should be criteria-based. We should establish sensible criteria, primarily dependent on, how effective the export control systems, how well enforced, cooperation on interdiction, all kinds of issues like that. Have nothing to do with their own nuclear weapons programs, but are they going to be, effective participants in the regime? And by the way, for new entrants into the regime, I would not allow them to have a veto on others, because that is obviously a concern. If India were admitted first into the NSG, would they use the consensus rule to prevent Pakistan? I think this would be the sensible approach. Pakistan would have to demonstrate, it has the legacy of AQ Khan. I think there's a statute of limitations on that. On that crime, and I think they can demonstrate that they've adopted a competent export control system. And this comes back to an issue that was raised in a plenary session yesterday. I would want to be pretty sure that Pakistan was not going to be assisting anybody in pursuing a fuel cycle program or a nuclear weapons program. And that goes in particular to the question of Pakistani-Saudi relationship. I would want that to be nailed down very, very clearly before I would want to support Pakistani membership.
Anything to add on this question of membership?
Yeah.
Then I want to turn to the discussion.
Yeah, an aspect that I'm not sure has been really thought through is what would be the consequences of India's membership in terms of access to technology, because the exception that's been given at the moment excludes sensitive technology. Obviously, if India was a full member, it would expect to have full privileges, and I think what NSG parties would have to think through is what's their attitude towards supplying technology equipment that could contribute to a weapons program, whether that's something that they're willing to do. And obviously the same question arises considering Pakistan, that the concern would be not only might Pakistan on supply to others, but it would obviously be trying to benefit its own military program. So I think this all points to the question of defining criteria. The basic criterion should be, does the regime benefit by having this country in or having it out? And there are arguments for having countries that are exporting in, so there are some rules for it to be tied to. But we would also need to think through, well, how will the country use technology that it's able to access for its own purposes.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so we're going to go to discussion. You guys know the drill. All my Pakistani friends getting in line. Let me guess. If it gets bored, if I get bored because it gets repetitive, you'll hear, and we'll skip around in the lines. But or do we have the microphone over there? Okay, let's start over there, and we'll work our way around. But seriously, if somebody else asks something that resembles the question you want to ask, do the audience and your country a favor. Don't repeat it, because people will become displeased with you and not want to improve relations with your country.
Mohammed Omar, National Defense University, Islamabad. We have to examine what was the need. I'm just going to ask this question. What was the need for the NSG in the first place? That's it.
All right, we'll take a couple, and then we'll come to the middle.
Hi, Deepthi Chobe, Foreign Policy Institute. Ambassador, so that I can understand India's allergy to the idea that the CTBT ratification should be linked as a condition to the deal. 10 years on, where India has worked hard to take this normalized place in the international order, can I ask you to what extent you think Delhi has internalized a calculation about that a test would jeopardize and void the progress that has been made? And in which case, do you think they really would test again? And if not, what do you think is barring the way to taking small steps, like monitoring stations, like there's one that's actually needed, a radionuclide station for the verification regime, or even becoming an observer state, things that can be done before a signature? Is it time really to take these steps that would actually make India, kind of add some more credence to this idea of India having these great nonproliferation credentials? Thank you.
Great. So let's take those two. Bob, you want to take the NSG one, or John? Why was the NSG? Where did the NSG come from? And then Rakesh, a Deepti's question.
I think this audience knows exactly where the NSG came from.
No,
The London.
Does anybody not know the basis? Give a very quick.
Well, I wasn't sure whether the question was ironic. As is very well known, the NSG was established largely in response to India's misuse of a research reactor which had been supplied under peaceful use conditions, where India produced plutonium and conducted what it described as a peaceful nuclear explosion. So this didn't violate the peaceful use conditions, according to India. There was also another driver, which, as I recall, was I think it was France's proposed supply of reprocessing technology to Pakistan. So the NSG was set up for those reasons, and I must say, sorry to be a party spoiler, but when India is described as having an unblemished non-proliferation record, of course, it was a proliferator in quite a spectacular way. And obviously we have to deal with the situation as we find it today, but I think the history is there, and it is ironic that India is now being asked to join, or is seeking to join, and has been promised help in joining the organisation that was actually established in response to its past behaviour.
Rakesh, on Deepti's question.
Well, I think yesterday we had the executive secretary of the CTBTO also talking about it. And I think the question of signature or ratification, or signature first and then ratification, obviously, is something that is going to take some time. For those of you who are probably, who might recall, that the idea of a voluntary moratorium was something that was agreed upon during the talks that took place 1998 to 2000 between Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh. And that moratorium, or the commitment to that moratorium, has been reiterated even in the 2005 and basically the 123 agreement and so on. So in that sense, that commitment to moratorium stands. Now, I think the Article 14 will sort of always rankle in a sense, because Article 14 was introduced at that point in time for entry into force of the CTBT after India had voluntarily withdrawn from the negotiations in 1996.
But what about a monitoring station? Leave the ratification
No.
aside.
So therefore, the idea, the political thing of signature, ratification, etc., is something which is going to take some amount of work before any of that is going to be considered positively. I understand that we already have some scientists, etc., who are, this is what the executive secretary was telling me, and I think he proposes to visit India, as he told me. And so there are Indian scientists and technologists who go work with or attend courses or whatever with the CTBTO. And I think as long as we create, or as long as the norm against testing continues, and I think that is what is critical, because at this stage, entry into force of the CTBT is something which seems to me to be politically a tough call.
But that wasn't her question. But Bob, do you have ideas on her question?
I have two proposals on nuclear testing. I don't think CTBT is going to enter into force anytime soon. I mean, it's not in, I mean, it's long way off. I'd suggest two ideas. One is for the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, India and Pakistan, to get together at the highest levels and issue a joint statement that for some period of time, 5 years, 10 years, none of them will be the first within this group to test a nuclear weapon. This gets around some of the problems with the CTBT, which is for the US Congress, it's forever, and it's legally binding. This would be a political commitment at the highest levels and so forth. Second proposal, people have talked about a Middle East zone of all, free of all weapons of mass destruction. Why not start off with a Middle East zone free of nuclear testing? So all of the members negotiate common verification arrangements and so forth, and they agree not to test nuclear weapons. 3 of the holdout states are in the region of the Middle East. Anyway, I think the 2 of these things taken together, I think would give a lot of confidence that there wouldn't be no nuclear tests. Let's leave North Korea aside for a moment. And part of the political commitment could be to take measures in the event that another country tested a nuclear weapon. So, maybe sanctions or some kind of pressures applied. But anyway, because the CTBT is not in the cards for the foreseeable future, I think we should think of other ways of constraining nuclear testing, and those are 2 ways.
Right. With Jessica.
Jessica Varnum from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey. My question is for Bob and perhaps also George, in that it is about U.S. interests in advocating for Indian membership in the NSG. You alluded to the fact that the consensus rules would potentially create issues for further membership expansion. But what's of interest to me is even just setting aside any concerns for U.S. interests in the nonproliferation regime and the possible detrimental effects of Indian membership on the NSG on that regime, as a completely separate issue, it seems to me the U.S. would have national interests that run counter to supporting Indian membership in the NSG purely because of the fact that the more members you add to the group, particularly some like India with disparate priorities, the more difficult it will be to pass decisions of interest to the United States on anything that goes on in the NSG.
The NSG started off as a like-minded group of 7 countries. It has expanded.
The London Club.
London Club, right, exactly. It was the G7 countries.
Yeah.
These were like-minded countries. It's expanded to the point where there's a lot of not so like-minded countries there. So I think, admitting India would not make consensus decision-making more difficult. It might even facilitate it. And I agree with the joint statement issued by Modi and Obama, which says that India is ready for NSG membership.
I have a somewhat different view, which is that it should be based on criteria, and that it's what we have going on is, and it's happened throughout history, a bilateral relationship informed also largely by trade considerations, which is fine, trumps these other issues. So those of us who raise these other issues, people around the present say...
I agree with you, but I'm not saying India is ready for membership because he's a good, it's a new important friend of the United States. It's ready for membership because it meets the criteria that I have in my head for being eligible for membership.
But then you as president should articulate those criteria and then say as policy we would support membership of anybody,
Yeah.
which isn't what's going on now because people basically are putting greater priority on other elements of the relationship and not nonproliferation, I think, is what's happening in the, in the way that this is being done. And then that has a rebound effect with others, I think. Let's go over here, and then we'll come back to the middle.
Hi, yes, Stephen from the Justice Institute. It's clear that India is a very responsible member of the international community. However, my question is, where does India stand on Iran's breakout?
for or against it, Rakesh?
Oh, I think that I think that I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I hope that the P5+1, the talks that are currently underway with Iran are, I hope that they are successful, and because I think that we need to find ways. And here, again, let me just put it like this. You know, please notice the framework. Every political reality is valid, and then, you know, there are other political realities that come. I mean, that's a way of life. And if you look at the Iran talks with P5+1 and the efforts with IAEA coming in as, you know, to do extra monitoring and whatever, I mean, it is not taking place in an NPT framework. We've got an NPT RevCon coming up in 2015, but it is taking place outside, but in some ways, a positive outcome before the end of March on this particular issue, I think will have a positive impact even on the 2005 NPT RevCon. So, and mind you, I'm saying this, India is not a party to the NPT, but I think that we are seeing this momentum for talks towards coming to some kind of an understanding on Iran nuclear program, addressing concerns arising from it, which I think is extremely positive. It provides a political moment at which we can hope that this moves forward.
Great. Here, and then we'll go to Zafar. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Ostroff with Platts Nuclear Publications. Soon after the summit between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi, both parties issued statements on the nuclear liability issue that in essence said, great progress has been made on this issue, details to come. Afterwards, a number of analysts said, in essence, that these parties declared victory and went home. They've papered it over. Let me just ask any one or all of the panel members as to whether they see any concrete movement or developments likely that will resolve the nuclear liability issue to the point that external vendors can sell and operate systems, reactors in India.
Great.
Thank you.
Hold that, Rakesh. I want to take Zafar's question, but we have in Rakesh a real expert on this issue, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, George. I have two very brief questions. One is from my American friends that, let's say from today, in the future, if this liability issue is resolved, how you people are looking, because from 2005 till 2008, there was a debate in the literature in the United States that if this deal entered into force, definitely there would be 27,000 jobs and $1 billion business for the reactor industry. How you people are looking in the future, that is there any, this kind of a big businesses coming to the United States? And second is, Bob, you referred that Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. Let me ask you a very simple question. If the South Koreans can deal with the Saudi Arabia, and Americans are negotiating or contemplating that why not they can go and invest in the Saudis or other Middle Eastern countries, nuclear fuel cycle industry or reactors industry, is it not appropriate that you people can permit India and Pakistan also to benefit from this commercial market under the IAEA safeguards?
Great. Thanks, Zafar. Do you want to take the liability issue real quick?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can talk about, you know, if you want a one-page answer, I wrote about it in the Hindu and an op-ed. If you want a 20-page answer, it is there on the ORF website. But to put, but
and I can give you a one-word answer, but go ahead.
But I think that Prime Minister Modi and President Obama, when they met in September in Washington, they understood as good politicians, as political leaders, as guys who were willing to take a risk, as leaders who were committed to India-US relationship, and they understood that this particular thing had been a hurdle and needed to be sorted out. And I think that's how they set up the contact group. The contact group met a couple of times after September when it was set up to resolve these matters, and January. when President Obama was in Delhi. The contact group analyzed it threadbare, came to whatever conclusions and reported back to the principals. And the two of them understood that this had to be sorted out in terms of language, which is why the idea of a legal memoranda being exchanged. And as I said, after that, we've had one workshop on international insurance pools. That was one of the sticking points as to how do you quantify. See, there are two particular clauses for those of you who want details. Section 17B of the liability law and 46.
But is it going to work? I mean, will it be sufficient? That was his question.
See,
will it be sufficient?
yes, it will be, because the same concerns that US vendors have are also the concerns that Indian vendors have. After all, we have an indigenous 700 megawatt nuclear power reactor program, which is ongoing, which has stalled because now this is completely indigenous and there is a whole bunch of Indian industry which provides reactor vessels, tubing, components, et cetera, et cetera. So they were equally concerned about what they perceived was ambiguity in the language. And their concerns are very similar to, let's say, the concerns raised by the lawyers of Westinghouse and GE and all the rest of it. Or, for that matter, the French Arriva and so on, or the Russians and so on. So the first evidence of this would be when we start looking at the Atomic Industrial Forum, the Indian Atomic Industrial Forum, and they have issued a statement that they find these assurances comfortable. So once they start, I think, the proof of that will be, as we see it growing, we'll find that the legal community will get satisfied both in terms of the insurance pools and in terms of the concerns about concurrent liability being applied to a potential nuclear damage.
I think the answer is no, but that's another.
No, the answer is yes.
No, I know. No, I'm just, we'll have a bet. In a year, ping us, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. His answer is definitely yes, mine's no. And then Zafir's question about basically American nuclear companies going to get rich and a lot of jobs out of this. What was the other one? Then Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, why shouldn't Pakistan be able to have commercial nuclear interactions with Saudi Arabia, which I don't think was the issue, but go ahead.
Yeah, Pakistan, India can have commercial nuclear relations with any countries in the Middle East or elsewhere, but it should not provide any technology or equipment related to sensitive parts of the fuel cycle, enrichment-related, reprocessing-related technology. But if it can sell reactors or parts or so forth in a transparent way, that's fine.
Yeah, that's straightforward. Let's go to Emily and come back to the middle. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, Emily Landau from the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. My question is for Bob Einhorn, and I want to go back to the point that you made about perhaps it should have been a criteria-based decision with regard to India. And my question is really, why did the United States not consider a similar deal with Israel? What made India uniquely worthy of this deal? Because when I think about the issues that you have raised here, which warranted the deal, relations with the United States, nonproliferation record, and a unique nuclear status that needs to be dealt with, I think that these are equally relevant to Israel. So my question is, why was this the case for India? Why not considered for Israel?
We can take one more here.
Thank you. This is Samir Ali Khan. And my question is that once India brought its already operating nuclear reactors under the IAEA safeguards, so did it also bring the spent fuel that was irradiated in those reactors under IAEA safeguards? Right. Because once we look at the IPFM reports from 2005, 7, and now, it appears that Indian fissile material stocks have decreased. Thank you.
Okay, John, you want to take that one really quick? And then, Bob, you take that one, and I may jump in.
I think the answer is no existing spent fuel was brought under safeguards.
Right.
The answer to Emily is because the decision in 2005 was not taken primarily on nonproliferation grounds. It was taken to remove a major obstacle to better U.S. Indian relations.
2 words, China market. It was balancing China, and it was a big commercial market for the U.S. Oh, and Indian American voters, but Israel has supporters in the United States too. That was why. So we have to wrap up. We have lunch across the hall as yesterday, but please join me in thanking John, Bob, and Rakesh.